Hey there, welcome to today's episode. In the last episode, I showed you that I bought an MPC 5000, and what I did with that was that I got that thing fixed up and then gave you guys a little walk around after it had all been cleaned up and polished. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I think at this point, I spotted this on eBay. It was advertised at £400, it is an MPC 2500, and taking a look at the photos, I knew that price wasn't particularly realistic because it is in pretty poor shape. But what I thought I could do was, rather than just clean this thing up and then show you it all working, I thought we could actually start from the ground up. Might be a couple of parts to this episode, depending on how bad this device is, but it would be cool to kind of walk you through the entire sort of restoration process. In terms of the story for this particular MPC 2500, it was on eBay, £400, or best offer. I came in at $250 because my reckoning and taking a look at the condition of the pads and the things that the seller had listed that weren't working, I thought $250 was a fair and realistic number. Now, at first, the seller came back at $300. I think that was his kind of minimum price, but because this thing sat for another week and then it had to be relisted, I came back again, and he'd also listed a couple of other things in between that time that weren't really working on the device. He seemed like a really nice and honest guy, and after a few conversations back and forth, he accepted my offer of $250, and that's where we are. Shout out to Andre, who's the guy that I bought this from. In his description on eBay of this particular unit, he had said that the B button isn't working. A bunch of the Tact switches seem to need like a heavy press because, of course, they're either starting to fail or they're just very gunked up. He said the pads are fully functioning, but I've yet to test that. And these fader switches here are really gunked up as well. They're really tight, so I'm loath to start shoving them around at the moment. We'll get into that when we start cleaning things up. He said that the card reader was working on the front of the device. I have tested that. It's the first thing I did when I got it home. I just turned it on to make sure we were getting power. Unfortunately, the seller was away on his Christmas holidays, so I picked this up from one of his family members. That meant that I couldn't really test it in situ, which I never really recommend, but because we'd had so many conversations back and forth, I felt like there was a very slim chance I was going to get this thing home and it would be just a brick. Now, this is my first time going around this unit. This is exactly as I picked it up. Let's talk about it cosmetically first, go through some of the things that need addressing. The overall condition is not too bad in terms of the metal casing. It is scratched along the underside, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and lift this thing up. It is heavy. It's an MPC 2500. These things are heavy, but you can hopefully see there are some scratches along the front panel. There's also some minor damage to the back corners. You can see that here and here. Nothing major to write home about. And in terms of scratches and things on the casing, I'm not really bothered if the machine looks like it's had some life, as long as the casing cleans up pretty well. I'm not going to be into reskinning the thing or trying to paint it or do anything like that. I really like the way these devices look just as they are, and if they've had a little bit of life, that's okay. Some things that I would address, though, is just the general condition in terms of the cleanliness of it. You can see these pads are pretty yellow and grimy. I'll try and zoom in a little bit closer. You'll also notice that the jog wheel has seen some use in its life. The kind of silver coating has come off, and generally most of the buttons and the ports and things are all just a little bit dusty and a bit gunked up. Now, the seller's already pointed out that a lot of the Tact switches aren't functioning properly. I'm not sure whether they can be cleaned or whether we're going to have to order some and get some soldering done on this. Obviously, I'm hoping for the easier solution, which would be to get things cleaned and maybe get life back to them. But soldering Tact switches on these isn't the end of the world if you have to. Now, as you can see, it's going to need a little bit of TLC, particularly in the cleaning department. A big problem with these devices, if they're owned by people who smoke, then that's how you generally get this kind of discoloration. And what I'll do is I'll post a little picture side by side between my 5000 and the 2500, because you will see how yellow these pads currently are. It was clearly owned by a smoker at some point in their life. I'm not sure if it was Andre, the guy that sold it to me. I don't know how long he'd had the device for. My initial thoughts are that he hasn't owned it for a very long time. He's bought it and decided that it was too much work for him. And as other people in the UK can tell you, they're not the cheapest things to restore when you need to get new switches or pads or things like that, because generally they need to come from America, from somewhere like MPCstuff.com. And although the prices are very reasonable over there, it's the shipping cost and getting that to the UK which becomes a bit of a pain in the bum. Now, while we're here as well, just have a quick look around some of the other sides of the device. You can see this one doesn't have the CD-ROM in it. The side panels are in need of a good clean. The back of it, as mentioned, is dusty. All of these ports, all of these inputs and outputs are going to need cleaning thoroughly just to make sure there's no problems. And although a little bit grimy, underneath is okay. You can see it's missing a foot from the middle of the device, so I'll pick up a new rubber foot for there. Okay, now that we've had a look at the sort of general overall condition of this unit, what we're going to do now is we're going to power this thing on so that we can make a checklist of what is and isn't working on it. See this one booting up. It does tell me it has 128 megabytes installed, so it's been maxed out in terms of its memory inside, which is good. It didn't come with a CF card, but I've got a few of those anyway, and I have tested to make sure that that is working, because I mentioned that in the MPC 5000 video. If there are any bent or broken pins on the CF card reader, that's a pretty expensive repair. It's very tricky as well. Now I'm going to start off in the middle with the pads because I want to know if the pads are triggering. For most of the pads except pad 4, there is a menu that can be accessed. Now this hasn't been updated to JJOS of any kind. This is still what I believe is the original Akai OS. Providing I can get this thing back to full working order, I will be updating it to JJOSXL because I think it is the far superior OS when you're working on these. So let's start there with the pads. Let's just see how many of the pads seem to be functioning. We're going to do that by doing mode, and we should be able to access our menu. So let's start with pad 1. Okay, pad 1 seems to be functioning because I can see it's opened up the menu. Let's go to mode, and we'll do pad 2, which again seems to be working as well. Andre, the guy that I bought it from, did say that he thought the pads were functioning. If we do mode and pad 3, you'll see we can access our memory card and things like that. Unfortunately, there's no extra menu for pad 4, so we'll have to come back to that one to see if it's working or not. Mode and pad 5 for record, that is opening. Mode and pad 6 for trim is also seems to be opening. Pad 7 is opening the programs, and I'm not having to thump these pads either, which is a good sign. I'm not having to really hammer these home in order to get the menus to function. They seem to be working okay, despite how grimy they are. Let's now do mode and pad 8. We can see our mixer view is working. Mode and pad 9 should be MIDI sync, which we can see, and it opens okay. Mode and pad 10 is other, so this is where you'll get some settings. Pad 11 also doesn't have any menu option for there, so pad 11 and 4 we'll come back and check later on. Mode and pad 12 should open up the effects section, which it does. Mode and pad 13 is sequence edit. Mode and pad 14, step edit, is working fine. Mode and grid edit is also working. And finally, mode and pad 16 should give us our sequence menu. So that's a really good sign. The pads feel pretty responsive. We do need to test pad 11 and pad 4, in which case I'm going to have to try and load up some samples. However, if the cursors and things aren't working, it's not going to be so easy to load samples onto the device, so we need to see whether we can even get that to work as well. Now, if we come back to the main page, Andre had told me that the F buttons didn't seem to be working. He said one worked, which maybe was F6. It was something to do with loading samples that he thought was working. But just while we're here, let's take a quick look. On the main menu, you have access to all of these little menu options. Let's just see. Now, with these old MPCs as well, it's not just a case of pressing and saying it doesn't work. Sometimes with the Tact switches, what they need is a real thump. So we are going to have to thump it a little bit in order to just make sure they are completely dead or certainly not getting any life. But my initial thoughts for F1, not responsive at all. F2, the same. F3, also the same. F4, similar. F5. Now, F5 is interesting because although it's not changing there, actually it is responding ever so slightly. You can see that. It's taking a little bit of a press and it kind of gets stuck, but it is turning the mute off and on. I was expecting the little mute button there to kind of darken, but actually where it says mute on and off, we can see that that is responding. So one of them is kind of responding, F5. F6, there is some life there as well. Now that's a pretty good sign. The reason for that being that if you've got at least some of these F buttons working, it means generally the whole F button board probably isn't kaput, because that is something that can happen, that the entire F switch board here can break. But I'm assuming if we've got some life to F5 and F6, it means really it's probably just more down to the Tact switches and not the entire board. Let's check a couple of other things. We should see a menu when we press input and through. Okay, which we do. That seems to be working as it should. We know the main button is working because I can come back from any of the menus that we're looking at, but we'll come back through those as well. Now, in terms of the record gain and the volume, I'm going to need to have some cables plugged in, and I'll wire this thing up a little bit later on so that we can see if we're getting some audio and just check a couple of other things there. Now, the seller had also told me that the bank B button wasn't working. I can see bank A is lit up, and then we've got bank B, C, and D. Now, when you're looking at these things online, you really do have to pay attention. And one thing that I had noticed that is a bit of a concern for me about this particular unit is that the C button isn't correct. You'll notice this C button has been swapped out for the bar button, which is down here. This is supposed to be a clear button because it lights up. And actually, for whatever reason, someone's been into this device before. I'm not sure if it was the guy that sold me it. I never got a chance to ask him, or a previous owner before that. But these buttons have definitely been switched around, which means that somebody has been tinkering with this before. It's not the end of the world, but that's not something that I really like to see, because dirt and muck and just things generally wearing out is one thing. But if someone's been in trying to bodge this thing together and trying to get it to work, and they've done a poor job of it, that can cause you more problems in the long run. And we may see something like that when we open this thing up. There may be more problems than I'm aware of. While we're here though, let's just test that though. B definitely isn't working, which I was told it wasn't. C, that does seem to be working, and I can see the LED behind. Even though this should be a clear button, I can see the LED lighting up, which is a good thing. D is also working. It doesn't click. It's strange. It's not got a click here. There's definitely something up with some of these. In fact, you can see this is a pretty wobbly switch. There may well be some actual broken switches. I might have to try and find some replacements. Now, one other thing that I've just discovered is that when you come back to bank A, or you try to go back to bank A, that isn't functioning, because bank A is the default when you turn the device on, which means that technically the bank A switch, although it lights up and you can access bank A just by turning the device off and on, we can't actually access it by pressing the switch. So bank A button and bank B button technically don't work. Underneath, we have our full level. That seems to engage with a bit of a thump, so it's clearly sticky, but it does seem to turn on and turn off. Now with 16 levels, what I've discovered is that it is working, and you can access the 16 levels, but it's not lighting up, which means chances are we need to try and find a new LED. That's a little bit of a problem, but it's not the end of the world. Next sequence seems to be working just fine. The track mute button also seems to be working okay as well. Now just back on the main page where we can check things out, if I use the data wheel here and scroll, it's got a healthy enough click. And despite looking pretty worn out, it is actually working as it should, seems to be dialing through. Underneath, we've got our fine tuning buttons. This button is super loose, so the actual plastic casing is probably a little bit broken, but it does seem to be triggering. It's a little off, probably because the button's slightly broken, but it is triggering up and down. So again, we've got some work to do here. Now, in order to test the numerical buttons, ideally we need to be able to kind of rename something. So normally when you've got something selected, we can use the window button. Thankfully, that is working, and I can see it lighting up again. It's stiff, it needs cleaning, but we can access this so that I can check the jog wheel again. So I can see that that's allowing me to do that, but it will allow us to use these numerical buttons, because technically you should be able to name things here. Now with the numerical buttons, they all seem to be working. The 0 needs a bit of a chunky press, and again, they feel kind of loose, so maybe some of the plastic's gone on some of these. The enter button seems to be working, which is good. Unfortunately, I don't seem to be getting anything from this plus and minus button here as well, and it is also pretty loose in its little housing. We know the mode button works because we've been doing the pads. Let's try the tap tempo button. That seems to be working. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the cursor buttons. We can move left and right, that's good. We can move up, that's good. Down works with a bit of a thump. If we quickly just jump back into grid edit, I've realized there's an easy way to test if pad 11 and 4 are working. If we do mode and grid edit, I should be able to select pad 11, which I can, and pad 4, so that clears that up. Now, I can't remember what I need to do to test the shift button, so I'll come back to that. The undo button again, without recording something in, which I'm not sure we've even got enough functions to load samples onto the pads and then record something. But what I will say about that is that it feels kind of wedged in there, it doesn't feel right. The step button seems to be working with a little bit of a push. The go-to button is working. Now, we've definitely got some problems with the bar buttons. They don't feel right at all. They feel like they've dropped down inside of the device. There's something completely wrong with those, and they're definitely not triggering, so that's going to be a problem. In terms of the buttons across the bottom, we've got play start, which seems to be working. Play seems to be working. Stop seems to be working. Play start and record seems to be working. And overdub is working as well. This actually gives us a chance to see if undo does work. And unfortunately, that's not responding either as it should. If we jump over to the left-hand side, let's do mode, and let's open up the slider options, because that's going to let us know if these are working. Now, this slider on the right-hand side is gunked up and it's stiff. The one on the left is really stiff, But I just want to see, it is registering because it jumped over to Q1, and I'm hoping if we move this one, it jumps back to Q2. So I'm assuming these are working. They're just really gunked up and they need a good clean. In terms of the erase button, that seems to be working okay. And with the note repeat button, it's sitting all wonky. There's definitely something wrong with the way the button is sitting, but it does seem to be triggering, so that's good. Let's take a look if the after buttons for the Q are working. You can see one seems to be responding. Second one is. Third one kind of. And the fourth one as well. The big problem with this device, and I think it's because somebody has been in tinkering with it, is that a lot of these buttons don't feel like they've either been clicked back in properly, or I'm hoping they're not completely damaged underneath, because we might need to order quite a few buttons for this in order to get it back into shape. We're not going to know till we open the thing up and take a look inside. Now quickly back in the Q mode as well, I just wanted to test the two rotary knobs, and they seem to be working because I can select Q3 and I can select Q4, so that's also a good sign. Now obviously at some point I need to test the audio as well. We need to be testing the inputs and outputs. The seller told me that the outputs were working, that he tested the outputs and they all seemed fine. And despite the fact that we've definitely got quite a few problems here, I'm not completely disheartened, and it feels like the seller was certainly honest. He told me about all of the issues that we had here. The final thing is going to be to open this thing up, take a look at the circuit boards and everything else, and just see what other problems we can find. Okay, it's time to strip this bad boy down. First thing we're going to do, of course, is disconnect the power. So we're going to turn it off, and we're going to make sure we take our power cord out. And the other thing that you can do is you can actually just quickly turn the device back on and just let it discharge anything through the capacitors, stuff like that. It's a quick way of just making sure that everything's set. And as you unscrew this thing, you're not really going to be at risk of getting any kind of electric shock. Now, this is my first time opening one of these, so we need to figure out exactly how it comes apart. My guess is that we're probably going to have to take the side panels off, and then we can take the front and the back. Basically, we want to try and get as much of this apart as humanly possible, but of course we don't want to disturb anything as we're going. A big tip I always say whenever you're taking things apart like this, make sure you've got places to put the screws, especially if there are different size screws. You want to have separate little containers, places where you can put them. And if you're in any doubt as to where screws went, just take photos of everything before you begin. Now, there'll be online manuals, tutorials for how to take these things apart, but I'm just going to wing it. I'm going to start with the side panels because I really want to strip the thing down anyway, so that I can just do a really deep clean of the unit because it's pretty manky. I'm going to start here with these side panels and take those off first. Got two screws by the looks of things. Now, it's not so easy to see on camera, but I know this from the MPC 5000. When you've taken the screws out of the side panels here, you have to push them towards the front of the device in order to get them off. There's like these little tabs that hook in. I've got to be honest, you can really smell the nicotine on this thing. It was definitely owned by a smoker at some point in his life. Now, with the side panels off, what I want to do is just quickly pop these knobs and the fader caps off because they'll be in the way otherwise. They also need some serious deep cleaning. They are absolutely brown. Really stuck on there quite well. With things like that, we'll probably just pop those into a pot later on to give them like a bit of a soak. Just looking at the front here, we have the memory card. I'm going to take the memory card out. Just be mindful of those tiny little pins because they can be very expensive to fix. Now, looking underneath, another telltale sign. This is good things to know when you're looking at the adverts. I'd already spotted this. There is a screw missing from this. I'll find another one in my parts box to replace it when we put it back together. But that's a clear indication that someone has been in here before us messing around with stuff. Now, I'm not 100% sure on this one. I'm going to start with the front panel. A lot of the time, you can access removing the top cover without having to completely remove the bottom cover, but the MPC 5000 did need a little bit of both. So I'm going to start with the top panel screws, see if we can get access that way, and if not, then we'll end up removing the bottom cover as well. But I like to limit the amount of stuff that I'm taking off at one particular time, just because it saves you having 1,000 different screws knocking about and having to know where they all went. Another thing very quickly is that our display is in good order. We want to keep it that way. So I'm just going to put some cardboard on here and just tape it on loosely. It doesn't have to be neat, but it just means when we flip the device over, I'm not worried about scratching over the display. I might even put a little cushion down or something as well, just to make sure, but just be mindful of things like that. You don't want to be sliding around on the LCD. Now, there were two screws. Technically, there should have been three, but we're missing a screw for the bottom of this front faceplate. And then there were two kind of smaller, like recess screws that go here and on the end. As I've unscrewed this one, you'll notice it must be a tight fit inside of the little holder because it's taken the little brass fitting with it as well. So that's something I'm going to have to address when I put it back later on. There's also a little CD drive cover that slots in there when you're taking this thing apart. If you've got a CD drive, obviously you won't have one of these. And with that, we have at least access to the front panel of the device where we can see the headphone ports, our CF card slot. There is a lot of griminess in here. I don't know how much you can see there, but there's just crumbs and dirt and all kinds of stuff. We've also got access to the little holder where you would put your hard drive. That's something I'm going to look at later on when I know the device is fully working, but I'll probably do some kind of hard drive upgrade or something in here. I don't believe this one has any kind of hard drive installed. Obviously as well, you've got the CD drive slot. If you were to find a CD drive, you wanted to install it, you could put it in here. But let's keep moving forward to see if we can get this top panel off. I'm going to start with the screws around the frame here, around this metal casing. You can see them dotted around the edge of the device. I'm going to start with those, and hopefully that's going to let us take the top off. Now, it feels like it's lifting up, I can see there, but there's something that seems to be still held on at the front, so we need to just double check we're not bending anything, make sure we've taken out any of the screws. One kind of unfortunate thing is that the buttons are already falling out inside here, which lets me know there are probably a few problems with some of the plastic buttons themselves. Now, there definitely are a couple of screws missing. They're these ones that you kind of come through the bottom plate, and then you get access underneath. I didn't spot those before, so we're going to take those out. Unfortunately, again, we're missing one here, which is a telltale sign somebody's been in messing with it already. But there are three of those. You've got one here, you've got one here, and then there's one moving through here. Now, with this particular unit, this is the most tense part for me because with all of these buttons feeling like they're not really clicked in, they're out of place, some of them have already dropped out. I need to know just how much damage has been created. Are we about to find a bunch of broken bits? My theory is yes. I'm not going to be surprised if we see quite a lot of damage. So let's just remove this top cover. There goes one of the buttons. Now I can already see some buttons that have snapped and broken, so we've got some button repair to do. That's not the end of the world. Look at the muck inside of there. That is pretty crazy how dirty this thing is inside. Also, these Q-Link sliders are looking pretty grotty. They do seem to function though, so hopefully everything, it's just a case of some time, some patience, cleaning things up. But I think I am going to have to order some plastic buttons. Now, having a quick inspection of this device, having never owned one of these, I've got no idea what this is, but you will notice there is this little tab here, which I initially thought was a grounding post, which I thought maybe should be attached to the circuit board, and it's been kind of unscrewed. But actually, if I just do that quite carefully, you'll notice it's not actually attached to anything. So if you read the comments and you have any idea where that's from, if I can't locate it myself or work it out, yeah, some help from the MPC user would be fine. But we have one stray thing. That's never a good sign. But we'll see what this links to later on. Hopefully we can find out where it came from, whether it's just randomly in there. Who knows? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to take off all of the plastic switches here because they need to come off anyway so the circuit boards and things can be cleaned. But I want to make a note of how many of these are damaged, and unfortunately it does look like quite a lot of them are damaged. One here is completely sheared off. You can see these are loose, these are just broken. This is all pretty bad news because yeah, it does mean ordering a lot of new switches. It's not the end of the world though. We will get a set of those ordered, but it just means I probably can't do a one-day fix on this one. It's going to take some time. Taking these little things off is pretty straightforward. There are two little prongs at the back of the plastic kind of switch itself, the button cover if you like, and you just need to press those in. You can kind of pincer them in towards themselves and then just pop the tops off. These little like pot covers can come out the way as well. These just get really manky, these little kind of dust covers, but they are, yeah, pretty manky. They'll clean up okay though. We have our jog wheel cover here that we're going to pop off and take out the way. That should just clip off. Again, it's pretty manky and it's seen some serious use. It's worn all the silver paint off. Okay, so we've got all of the plastic buttons stripped out the way. We'll take this pad cover off in a second, which is just kind of floating around. This is so manky inside, it's crazy. I'm not even sure how these pad sensors are still working because underneath this, if we just peel that thing back for a second, look at the dirt on the sensor sheet. I don't know if I've ever seen any pads so dirty inside before. Of course, I'm going to have to go through very carefully with each of these buttons, the plastic buttons, because even if they appear pretty good, because so many of them are actually physically like snapped and broken, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a lot of wear on these like little pieces in here. A whole new set of buttons is probably the better option for this, but that can still be relatively expensive. So I'll go through because I like to replace things with the originals wherever possible, but if it needs junking, then it needs junking. So we'll count those up and see what we've got. Now, of course, we're going to have to take this pad sheet out of the way. I mean, that's insane how dirty that is. We're going to clean all that up. I'm hoping, I'm not 100% sure, that we get these back to almost the original grey with a little bit of a scrub, because other than the fact that they're really dirty, there isn't really any major damage to these pads, not that I can see so far. Of course, we're going to clean all the pad sensors, but everything, even all the circuit boards, there's just so much junk in here, dust and dirt. All of this is going to need to be stripped and cleaned. And generally when I'm in here where you have all of these connectors, things like this, these will all be carefully documented and taken apart, cleaned, and then everything will be put back. I'm not sure I'm going to film that entire process because it's a bit long-winded and a bit slow, but just know that that's what we're going to do as we're moving through. The other thing that really we should do at this point is do another switch check, because some of these switches, because these were all broken into pieces, certainly a lot of these plastic ones like this one here, where it's been snapped into two pieces, the reason the button might not be functioning is simply because the plastic top part of the button might not really be working. Either that or it's so stiff someone's been really hammering on these things and they've broken them. Of course, if you do that, you're plugging power back into this thing and you've got this thing open. You do need to be mindful that you're working with an electronic device. You don't want to be getting any electric shocks, so you do need to be careful. But that is one thing that I would do probably once this has all been cleaned up. There's no point in putting power back through this thing till we've started to clean all these circuit boards, so you might as well just get everything clean now, and then we can move forward from there. Now, I do want to take a peek inside underneath. One thing I noticed, if you look here very closely, if we can lift this thing up, is it does actually look like where that little cable was that I took off before, I can kind of see what looks like it's marked as a grounding tab of some sort, little tab on the circuit board. So I'm wondering whether somewhere underneath in this casing, there is a wire that is missing its end that will need to be resoldered on. So I'm going to do a little bit more investigation into that. And I think one of the easiest places to start is to take the bottom part off. In order to do that, again, though, I am going to protect my screen, just make sure we're not, damaging anything here. Being mindful where we're sticking this tape, of course, with the electrics and stuff. Now, to take the bottom part off, I've actually just got this sitting on quite a decent sized cardboard box because I don't want to put any pressure onto the pots or the faders or anything when this is sitting underneath. So it's just got a little cardboard box underneath that this is just kind of being raised up on. You've got this cover where you can access the memory, so if you need to upgrade your memory. This one is maxed out anyway, but that's how you access it. There is a little access panel on the back of the unit. Okay, with the screws out for the back panel, let's lift this thing up and see what it's like in here. I'm expecting still a lot of grime and dirt. And yeah, I'm not going to be disappointed with that. That is also pretty grimy, so we're going to have to clean all of this up. Look at the color difference here. You can see that is pretty crazy. Now, the circuit boards don't look too bad. They look relatively clean on this underside of the device. It's definitely worse up top. The one thing I was looking for was to see whether there was some kind of cable here that would have a little grounding tab or something on it that should be linked through to the other side. But so far, actually, I can't see anything. So I'm going to have to ask a couple of other people and maybe see if I can get some photos online of one of these stripped down to just see if there is a missing little cable there, something that should be in place that currently isn't. Other than that, while this thing is open and I've got it this way, I'll probably start this way up actually, and we'll clean all of the bottom side out just using some contact cleaner. I like to use little soft paint brushes, something that's not going to damage things, move things around too much. We'll just give everything a good dust and a clean out inside of here, and then we can move to the top surface. Now, as for cleaners, this is no sponsored post. This is just something that you can get here in the UK. Hopefully you can see that. It is WD-40 electrical contact cleaner. It's not standard WD-40. It is a contact cleaner. It's cheap for a decent sized tin of this, about 10 quid from Screwfix. My preferred one is the Deoxit. That's a really nice one, but I believe it comes from America. So it's like £30 for a tin, I think, in the UK. Normally what I have lurking around, and I think I've still got some, is one of the little tubes. You can buy a little tube of it for about £10. You only need a little drop, but between this contact cleaner and the deoxit, normally for putting it into the Tact switches and kind of giving them a good massage, I'm really hoping that we can maybe get some of the non-responsive Tact switches back to life. We don't have to do too much soldering. Now I'm going to be spraying in contact cleaner and just moving around with this nice soft clean artist paintbrush. I'm an artist, so I've always got tons of these knocking about, but if you want to use some other equivalent, you can do a toothbrush maybe. You don't want anything too harsh though, because you want to be carefully coming between like the capacitors and stuff, just so that you're just giving it a nice gentle clean and a dust, getting any grime, muck out of there. For a little time now, just making sure this is all dusted out can make a big difference later on. These are also quite useful for a bunch of different things. I keep them in the studio just for generally cleaning my gear out. They're these cheap lens wipes. You get them from places like Lidl or Aldi or whatever. Really cheap, but they're like little alcohol wipes. Come in these little sachet things. They're very useful for just wiping down surfaces. I'll generally use some of those to maybe clean bigger areas around cables and stuff. Just any way to get the grime out. Another thing I've discovered on this one is there is this grounding cable. Now, when someone's tried to take this apart before, they've loosened this screw here, assuming it probably took the casing off. But what they've done is they've actually loosened this grounding cable up. So we need a little spanner, just a little nut to grab onto this, and we'll tighten this thing up while we're back in here. Keep an eye on that, all of your connections. Just make sure nothing is loose. Make sure it's all put back as it should be. So I'm pretty happy with the underside of this now. We've been right round all the circuit boards and stuff. That means what I'm going to do is I'm going to tip it up and we can take a look at these back ports. So here we have all of the outputs, the inputs on the back of the device. What I like to use with these, a little bit more contact cleaner, and I like using these. These are little brushes for cleaning baby bottles, strangely enough. Obviously, you do not want to clean your baby bottles and your MPCs with the same one. But if you've got a couple of spare ones of these, they're quite good for putting down into these little output slots. The reason for that being is that they're relatively gentle. They're not going to be scratching the surface of anything. But I'd spray a little contact cleaner into some of these ports and just give this a little gentle kind of wiggle up and down. But just give them a little blowout with an air duster towards the end as well, just to make sure there's no debris. But they are particularly useful for getting in and cleaning some of these ports. Something like the MIDI ports, a little bit of contact cleaner, and I'm just going back to my paintbrush to kind of just wiggle that around in there as best as you can. They're not the easiest things to get into. It's amazing where the dirt gathers. You can see it all inside of the power socket and around the edges. So all of that we're going to clean out, all of that gunk around our main power switch. Obviously, we're going to do the same process for these ports on the front around the CF card. Just being very careful again with the CF card. You don't want to be putting anything in there and wiggling around and bending those pins. But you can hopefully see all of that grime that needs to be taken out of there. There's crumbs and all kinds of mess. While we're in this area, there are these two screws here that open up this little tray. This pops out. It's where you can put an internal hard drive. I'm going to take that out just to give it a quick clean and then put it back in while I'm in here. You have the same thing inside the MPC 1000s, just a little hard drive tray that pops out. And you can install your internal hard drive. One thing you can get adapters to put SSDs in. And you can also get an adapter that lets you convert this to just put like an SD card inside of here. Now, I'm happy that we've done a pretty good cleanup underside, both the front and the back panels, including inside these trays where the drives and stuff go. All the dust's been removed, everything's been cleaned. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to tidy up my desk a little bit, because when you're working like this, you notice things become like a little bit of a mess. And then we can get this thing back onto its front and start cleaning up the top. One thing I am going to do though, is I'm going to put the bottom panel back on just so that we're protecting everything that we've cleaned here. You may get the odd little bit of dirt that falls through when you're cleaning from the top panel, but before I screw everything together properly, I'll take the bottom panel back off again and just make sure it's dusted through one last time. For this bit, I'll probably just put, say, 4 corner screws in just to keep the bottom panel in place so we can sit this thing comfortably without disturbing any wires or anything on the top. Just very quickly while we pick up the bottom panel to screw back on, I'm not sure how well it picks up in the camera, but just look, this is a plain white desk. All of this is the dirt that has fallen out so far on this particular MPC. So here's the metal cover that we had before. We know inside it is still pretty disgusting, so we're going to start by cleaning this thing up, getting rid of the last of the big heavy mess before we bring the main guts of the MPC back over. I'm going to get out my isopropyl and we'll use a little sponge and just try and give this thing a bit of a better scrub. Now it's not perfect, there are still some oxidation marks because this is metal and obviously there's been a little bit of moisture at some point, but it is clean if nothing else. Most of the yellowy tar-like substance has been removed. On the other side where we have the labels and things, we have something similar. I'm hoping some of this might come off. As long as it's nice and clean and free from dust, I'll be happy enough. Alright, let's get the desk cleaned up. Okay, so a quick cleanup of the desk. We can now just put the bottom panel on. As I said, 4 screws loosely just so that we can flip this thing over and work on the top. Alright, back to the manky top surface. We can take this off out the way. Of course, this is just protecting our LCD, but we'll give the LCD and stuff a bit of a clean while we're in here as well. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing as we did on the underside. I'm going to come through very carefully with some contact cleaner, spray all of this down. There's a lot of areas that need attention. This one by the little jog wheel in particular. Hopefully you guys can see that there, but this is particularly crusty around this thing. Now, another area to pay attention to is just when you lift up the folding screen. This gets full of muck and dirt. There's dust. There's all kinds in here, so it's well worth giving all of this a clean out as well. Same with these like little grated lines across the top of the screen. There's all kinds of dust and stuff trapped in there. We'll get rid of all of that as we're going through. Another thing I've noticed is missing is there are a couple of little rubber kind of feet. The one on this side is missing, so again, as part of my little shopping list, a couple of screws that are missing, and I'll try and find some replacements for these little rubber stoppers. With the underside of this all cleaned out, we can just give the LCD a nice gentle clean. No point in being too rough with this and scratching up or anything. It does look pretty good. I dare say there will be some very light scratching to this for the age of the unit. Okay, that's been cleaned, and if we just put it into the light, you can see it's pretty good. Now time to get to these manky pads and the manky circuit boards. I'm going to start off at the back where the casing is, the metal casing, just get all of this cleaned up first. So the circuit boards have had their first initial clean. I don't deep dive into the Tact switches until I've just got most of the debris out of the way. I just want to make sure that when we're starting to get into the individual Tact switches and things like that, as we start cleaning them, to give them the best chance, I don't want any bits of other grime or muck being able to get in there. Then we'll run through all of the Tact switches, cleaning those individually. Same with our faders and things like that. Then we can do a final test and see what works, what doesn't, and what we might have to put on our shopping list of parts. Again, I'm not sure how much of it picks up on camera, but there is so much dirt that's just come off the circuit boards alone. Let's get the pad sensor sheet cleaned up next. I'm just going to be using some alcohol wipes again to do this quite gently. It is going to need a thorough clean, but of course you've got circuit boards, you've got pad sensors. You really don't want to disturb these too much, but they are caked in filth. Now, there are certain parts of this job that are just generally time consuming, but look at these pads where you can see all of this sticky residue crap that's over the top of them. None of that should be there. Just want to try and tilt it into the light so you can see the sensor sheet. You can just see how much stuff is caked all over this thing. So we're just going to keep plodding on. It's going to be a slow journey, but I'm going to get all of these things cleaned back up. So without a doubt, one of the most time-consuming parts of this so far has been cleaning that sensor sheet to get it as clean as humanly possible. There's a little alcohol still in there, so we're going to have to let that evaporate. But other than that, hopefully, when we put this thing back together, everything will work as it should. And now comes another long and methodical part of this process. It is a case of spraying some contact cleaner into each Tact switch, into each pot, and giving it a little bit of a spin. And in the case of the Tact switches, you just really want to massage those switches up and down, tap them for quite some time to make sure that that contact cleaner is in there. It gives them the best chance of bringing them back to life if they're non-responsive. It doesn't always work. It's not foolproof. There may be some soldering we need to do, but it's worth trying because it can save you a bunch of time and money. Now, in order to go through them when you've got as many as this, I suggest you just take your time, start in one corner. I'm going to do everything on the left-hand side, including putting some lube into these faders and giving these a clean because these are really gunked up. They're really stiff. They barely move. And I'm hoping we can bring some life back into those as we go along. Now, when it comes to your Tact switches, whether it's the big red ones or the smaller ones, what you're aiming for is to put some of the cleaning fluid on top of the switch directly so that it falls in down around the side of the switch. So of course this little circle element in the middle where it clicks, that is the switch itself. And you can normally tell it's working because you will see that fluid, the cleaning fluid, disappear into the switch. There isn't really any other way of accessing them. This is the product that I like to use for faders and things like that, this Deoxit. Great cleaner in general. The only problem with it in the UK is it's pretty expensive. It's about 10 quid for this, but you do only use drops of it. I've put some of that into the little faders on the side here, and they seem to be sliding a lot more smoothly than they did before. Give them a good clean out. Now that we've done everything on the left-hand side, we're just going to run along the F switches, and then we'll move on to the main board. Okay, the F switches are done. Time to move on to the main board. As I say, this is a time-consuming and fiddly job. You're just going to do each one. You'll notice that I tend to work individually on each switch as well, only because this is contact cleaner. It's designed to evaporate. So if you spray a bunch of these and then come back and start messing around with them, by the time you've done that, it's probably evaporated. So I suggest just taking your time, picking each one and spending a little time with it. Another thing that I'm doing here as well, sometimes it's a bit annoying doing it with your finger. I just use the end of a paintbrush or something to do the little massaging part, kind of bring that in. So yeah, let's continue with this right hand side. We can get this thing turned back on and see if we've made any improvements, what we need on our shopping list. And unfortunately, this isn't going to be a one-part video. I wasn't sure until I opened the thing up, but I'm going to have to order some parts. We'll come back and do a part 2. Now that we've finished cleaning all the Tact switches and things like that, we need to give that a little bit of a chance to dry out. While we're doing that, I'd like to test the pad sensors and things, and I'd like to do that with the pad sheet. So let's turn our attentions to this disgusting mess. You can see where these are really yellow, and I'm assuming that is from like nicotine being in like a smoky environment for some time. You can see the side part that's been covered up is the original gray. It's quite night and day difference really. I'm not sure how much of this yellowing we'll be able to take off. That might be kind of permanently ingrained in there. I'm going to start with some soapy water, little toothbrush, and we'll clean them with those. And if that doesn't work, we can maybe try just a sort of mild bleach solution and see what that does for them. But let's start with the soapy water anyway. You can see the soap is certainly taking off the grime, but the yellowness is still there. So the soapy water did a good job of just taking off any grease and grime. Unfortunately, it's not doing anything for this nicotine stained finish that we've got here. I could try a mild bleach solution. I'm not going to do that on camera just simply because I don't want to have a bleach setup here in the studio. So I'll experiment with a couple of other things to see if I can get these any cleaner at some point, and I'll come back to you on that if I come up with a solution. The pad sensor sheet is in good condition. The pads don't really have any damage or anything. So I'm not too keen on the idea of having to buy a replacement sensor sheet because, again, in the UK to get one from MPC stuff, it probably adds around £100, and that's going to eat right into our budget for what we paid on the sampler. I also don't really mind. The sampler's never going to look mint, so maybe we can live with the slightly yellowed finish, but if there's a way to get that off, I'd like to see if we could. Now, just while we've got the soapy water out, I'm going to give all the rotary knobs and the sliders a quick first going over, but again, I think they might benefit from maybe just a little overnight soak in some bleach to get them really clean. You can hopefully see how brown and mucky those are. Even just with a soapy water clean, they look 10 times better already. All that brown gunge has kind of been removed. We'll come back to the main cleaning in part 2 because I've still got to do all the outer case, and obviously we're not going to do that until we've fixed any potential internal problems. But for now, pretty happy with how they've come up. Okay, that is going to do us for today. I've reached the point here now where we can't really go any further, but what we can do is we can turn this back on and just see what today's efforts have brought us. We know we had a bunch of problems with some of the Tact switches, and one thing I'm just going to do is I'm going to grab a little paint marker pen so that we can run through all the switches again, just see what happens now that we've cleaned them, and we will make some marks where we have problems. Okay. That one's a little fussy. It is working, but what I might do with that one is I might hit this one again with the cleaning solution before I go to the hassle of actually desoldering from the board and putting a new one in. So I'm just going to put a little purple dot next to that one. Now this will be interesting because I was told when I bought this that the F switches weren't working. We tested that earlier in the video. I think mute and solo, so the F5 and the F6 buttons were kind of working, but let's see if we brought any life back to these. Yes, we have indeed. So you'll see already the power of spending a little time cleaning these Tact switches. They don't always need repairing. That seems to be working just fine. Let's see if F2 is doing its job. Yes, it is. Fantastic. Oh, or do you have to? Oh, sorry. No, that's because you have to close with F4. F4. All right, let's see what happens. So it's strange because you can open and close with F1, but if you do F2, you can only close with F4. That's interesting. Anyway, it does seem to be working. We've got our track buttons here, so can we add extra tracks and take them away? This is minus, so we need to add a track first, perhaps. So this is the F4 button. Is that doing something? Oh, yes, it is. Sorry, I can see it there. It's adding tracks in. Yeah, that seems to be just fine. Can we take them away? Yes, we can. Fantastic. So we seem to have fixed most of these buttons. Is that working? Yes. It is strange because when you press solo, it goes dark like this, so I expect mute to do the same when mute is on, but it doesn't. But you can see mute is turning off and on there, and it seems to be pretty consistent, as is solo. So the F buttons now seem to be working. That is really good. We know that bank A lit up because that's the default bank, but it was broken and you couldn't switch back to it. If we took a look at B, that was also dead. B is now working. Fantastic. We've got C, we've got D. Can we get a full house here and go back to A? Yes, we can. Fantastic. There's nothing like fixing something for yourself. It's very satisfying. Okay, number 2 is taking a little bit of a hit there, so that's not quite as it was before, but I thought they were working quite well, so I'm just going to put another little drop of lube into this one, and I'm also just going to put a little mark next to the number 2 to know to come back to it. 2 and 3, maybe some slight issues there, so I'll put a couple of little purple dots next to those. Right, the cursor buttons themselves. So we had a couple of little problems before. It seemed like left and right was working okay, but up and down, I believe there was a problem with the down button that was really needing to be slammed. So let's see what's happening now. Can move left and right. Okay, that seems fine. And moving down now seems to be working. Or was it up? We had a problem with one of them. Oh no, it seems to be. Again, sometimes maybe it just needs to wake up a little bit. I'll put a little bit more deoxit in there. But yeah, that up button's got the tiniest little bit of hesitancy. Let's take that off. And what we'll do is we'll put a little drop in there to go off overnight. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, the undo button is definitely not responding. I'll try a little bit more lube. We'll try it again tomorrow, but it looks like the undo button may have to be replaced. Put a little purple dot there for that one. Yeah, that one's got a little hesitancy to it. I'm going to put another drop of lube into this one. and we'll make a note to come back and take a look at the locate button. These two bar buttons, they weren't working at all, so this will be interesting to see. Okay, so that is now working. That's good. We can move to the end. Can we move back? Yeah, unfortunately, we've got one that's dead here. That is not moving back at all on the bar button. So we fixed one, and one is still broken. We'll put a purple dot there to come back to that. So the final test here before I sign off, I just want to see whether we've got enough buttons now to load some samples onto some of the pads so that we can test the pads and make sure they're still playing. So if we say this is save, I want to go to load and I want to find some samples so I can see my samples folder. We got bass notes. Don't know how you scroll through these. How do you get down? Here we go. Kicks. Let's go into kicks. So we've got some samples ready. Let's see if we've got any audio. Okay, turned up the audio on this a little bit. I'm running it through the SP. Excellent. We can hear samples and we can hear audio. So that's a good start. So I can audition samples. The next thing I want to do is just test whether we can load them in. So let's say do it. We want to load this one, assign it to pad A1. That is good. And we can say keep. Okay, so we've got a kick drum loaded up. That makes sense. All right, let's load up a few samples onto the 16 pads so that we can just test out all of the pads and make sure they're working. Okay, so quickly, I just loaded some samples onto all of the pads. I can see from the settings menu, if we do mode, and we go to pad 10, that as I'm applying some pressure here, this is a pad sensitivity 16, so it's pretty high. If we turn fixed velocity off, you'll see that as you apply some pressure, we're getting a good range here, so everything should be pretty good. You can see as I'm applying more pressure, that slider is moving up as it should. So we should be able to just run through these samples now very quickly. Just check that all the pads are triggering. Kick drum, hi-hat, snares. It's like an open hat and then a bass sound. Another kick drum, another one. Just loaded up anything. Hi-hats. Some effect sounds. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. I think that's a pretty good effort considering the F switches were broken. We had broken bank switches, which we fixed. We've actually managed to cure a lot of the problems and really clear this thing up. Sure, we've still got a couple of Tact switches that I've marked out that are either completely non-responsive or they may just need another hit with the cleaner left overnight. We'll see what happens tomorrow. But these Tact switches are very inexpensive. Only 4 little pins that need to be soldered. It's not a particularly difficult job. I've got one LED here to do at the same time while I'm in there. We'll take care of that in part 2. And hopefully what we can do is try and find a solution to clean the pads a little bit more, maybe get them to look a little bit more grey. I think they're okay. I think by the time the casing's back on and everything else, they will look fine, but I really don't want to have to replace anything that really doesn't need it because it's just money that you end up spending. And I'm trying to keep my budget as low as possible for this particular device. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. So here we are with part 2 of our restoration on this MPC 2500. Unfortunately, it wasn't a one-day job. Sometimes you touch lucky, you can get in there, you can get the thing cleaned up and get everything working. At the end of part 1, basically we'd stripped everything down, we've cleaned all of the chassis, all of the circuit boards. We had a few non-working Tact switches still, despite my best efforts. And we also had a bunch of broken buttons that kind of just fell out of the unit when we took this thing apart. Now to get you guys caught up with what I've been doing over the last couple of days, the first thing was that I really wanted to spend more time on the Tact switches themselves, and I am pleased to say that we now have a full working set of Tact switches without the need to do any soldering. At the end of part 1, I said I was going to put some more deoxit into some of these switches, let it sit overnight and then come back and try again. And with some persistence and just generally hitting these switches multiple times, I've now managed to get life back to every single Tact switch without the need for soldering. In a second, I'll turn the device on so you can take a look, but there's a couple of other things I want to talk about as well as we go through. The faders also needed re-cleaning again. They just weren't as smooth as they could be. They now work really nicely. You'll notice the rubber pads are now back in place and they're looking a hell of a lot cleaner. They still have a slightly yellow tinge to them. Unfortunately, it's kind of really ingrained into this pad set, so at some point in the future, I will probably upgrade this to a brand new pad set. I might go for black or change the color or something, but in comparison to what they looked like originally, they really have cleaned up quite a lot. Now, I tried a couple of different things that I'd read online. One of them was toothpaste, one of them was using some bleach. Tried all of those methods. As you can see, there is still this kind of slightly yellow yellow nicotine kind of color. But when the unit is all put back together and you can't see the gray next to the sort of slightly yellowing gray, then actually it looks pretty clean and pretty tidy. All of the buttons and the fader cap scrubbed up really well, and you can see I've gone ahead and put back the little black dust covers before I put these knobs back into place. What I've also done was I took the original jog wheel, sanded that down. The original silver paint had started to wear off, so I just gave it a quick fresh coat of matte black because I had some in the garage, and the black looks really cool. I also managed to find the other missing rubber bump stop from behind the display. It's what the display rests upon. That was a lucky find because it had dropped onto the floor and it must have been loose, but they've now both been re-glued and put back as they should be, so that's a good thing. Now if you take one of these apart, I had a question originally about a small piece of black wire that was at the top here. Now my suspicions were correct, that's not actually like a loose wire, but what I didn't realize was that it's just a little bit of bent wire that they use to create like a little kind of cradle, like a little harness for the wires, as to kind of just join it to the circuit board and keep it in place. Now because this device had been tampered with, someone had just left that thing just lying loose in the bottom. But if you look closely at the diagram on the circuit board, it does show you where it needs to be screwed back in. So I've screwed that back in and secured the wires as they should be. And the other big job that I've been working on for the last couple of days was to sort out the broken buttons. Now that turned into quite a big job because my initial approach was this, where I created these little tabs to fix the broken buttons that were already there. And you can see how the button top had separated from the back. I just used a simple plastic tab and some epoxy to put that back into place so that the button still had some movement and then it could go back in. The problem with that though is that it allowed too much side to side movement, so as much as it was kind of fixed, it wasn't really an ideal solution. Now I'm sure if you're into MPCs, you'll be wondering why I wouldn't just go for a full set of new buttons. Big problem with that is that because I live in the UK, in order to get a full set, even just to pick up a few buttons because of the shipping costs from America, I was looking at a minimum of at least £50. Now one thing that my partner pointed out to me was that actually we still own a 3D printer and it's been gathering dust in the garage for quite some time. So we decided to dig the old 3D printer out. She's actually really good at setting up the 3D printer. I'm pretty useless with it. But what I am good at is drawing, and so I got stuck into the Onshape app inside of the iPad, which I'll show you now. Now, I've never really done a lot of 3D modeling and wasn't too sure whether I could recreate this, but just taking my time with a ruler, one of the original buttons, and kind of working this out using Onshape, which is free for the iPad as long as your project is public, which I'm okay with. I managed to successfully recreate the original MPC button, which you can see here. We created this 3D model. Hopefully it's not glaring too much on the screen. Now, what I was hoping for initially was that someone had already done the hard work for me, but I actually paid and downloaded a couple of models that I found on Thingiverse and some other 3D printing site. Unfortunately, both of those models were completely wrong in terms of the scale and size. I'm not sure if they were for a slightly different MPC model. It seemed to be the same button. However, they both printed out much smaller, and it wasn't a 3D printing setting. It was just the model itself wasn't correct, hence why I then came in and created my own. But I'm pretty happy with how this thing turned out because it's a pretty good replica of the original button, including all the kind of hollowed out button head and everything else like that. Now, once I got it 3D modeled, my partner set up the 3D printer, and it worked out roughly to do a nice fine resolution 3D print of one of these buttons. It takes roughly about 30 minutes, so it wasn't too bad. If you remember from the first part of the video, it was most of the clear buttons that were actually damaged. Most of the other buttons were just fine. And if I just pop one off of the device here for a second, you can take a little bit of a look at my little 3D printed button. Now it's rough at the back. Most 3D prints are pretty rough. Doesn't really matter to me though, because the only part that actually shows is the top surface where the button is. Now these aren't as transparent as the original buttons, but I used the clear filament core PLA Plus. And actually, because these are 3D printed, the fact that it's not completely translucent I think is better, because you might see some of the rough edges inside. But despite the fact that we 3D printed these and we used a clear filament, they actually turned out really nice. They didn't really need a lot of cleaning up. Just at the back where you have a little support when you 3D print it out needs to be removed. A little bit of filing, a little bit of sanding just to make sure that the button head itself looks good. And I really think they look pretty sweet when they're in situ. In terms of the operation, they feel exactly like the original buttons. There is just a small amount of give that allows the button to click. And because they didn't look exactly like the original MPC ones, what I did was I printed out enough to replace all of the clear buttons on the device. Now, one final problem I had with the buttons is that one of the white buttons, or what were white at one point, they're now more of an off-white color just from age. One of those are broken as well. I didn't really want one glaringly white button either, so I didn't really want to buy a new one or even 3D print one in white. And so what I've done is I just printed one extra clear button, and I'm using that as the shift button. Despite the fact that there's no LED behind it, it just felt like the most natural placement because it's next to another clear button. It looks fine when everything's on. Of course, it doesn't light up because the shift button doesn't. buttons. So very quickly now, let's just plug the device back in. I just want to show you we have a full working set of buttons. Now that we've got some power here, you'll notice I've installed the full version of JJOSXL. In my opinion, it is the best OS for this device. It's definitely worth getting the full paid up version of it. And you're not just limited to one version either. I believe once you've got a password for the device, you've paid for the full OS. You can actually then choose between some of the other OS versions that are available, like OS 3. I like the traditional OS XL simply because the workflow on it is really, really good. Now you can see with the power back to the device, let's just quickly run through the buttons, particularly the ones that weren't working. But our input button is fine. That is working as it should. All of the bank buttons are now working exactly as they should. The flickering of the LEDs is purely because of the way the camera's picking it up. Underneath, we've got our full level button. That is now working as it should be. We also have our 16 velocities button. Now, in the first part, what I mentioned was that the LED was broken here, but I realized actually that it isn't. That was my bad. That is because it only lights up when you turn this on. So when I turn it on, the LED is working as it should. I've tested out all of the F buttons. I know all of these are now working exactly as they should. You can add your tracks, remove them. Mute and solo is working perfectly. All of the Q-Link buttons are working. Our main mode button works as well, and you can see that flashing. You can see the window button lighting up as well. And if we pretend like we're going to record something for a second, just put some MIDI information in and click stop, you'll see the undo button is also working. And we can turn that off as well. I've got to say, I'm pretty happy with the result, particularly because we didn't have to resort to any soldering. I said it in the first part, it's not the end of the world. They are cheap to buy, the Tact switches, and they're a pretty easy fix. You just need to make sure that you snip them off the board first and then solder them from underneath. But in this case, the deoxit and the contact cleaner did their job. One bit of advice is just don't give up. If it doesn't feel like it's working for you straight away, put a little deoxit in there, leave it overnight, come back, and just hit those buttons a good few times. Really work those in, and fingers crossed, you'll get the same result. Now, one other thing to mention about the Tact switches, it's not just the function of the Tact switch that wears. Even if a button is still working, you may find that it loses some of its click, and that's because the little heads on the buttons can wear down over time. A few of the buttons on this device are kind of like that. They've worn down a little. One thing, when I was 3D printing the model, I deliberately left a little bit of extra material where the button meets the Tact switch. That can compensate for any buttons that have worn down a little bit, and also you can just file it to suit. But I dare say in the long term, I'm going to add this particular device to my permanent collection because I've always wanted one of these. So at some point in its future, it probably will receive a few new Tact switches simply because it's nice to have that very clicky button. But it is all working now, so it's time to get to the point where we start to reassemble this thing. The last jobs on the list really are to clean the case, which we're going to do next. We're going to clean the outer casing, and then we can actually begin to get this thing fitted back up. Now, I mentioned in part one, the casing is pretty scuffed up. It's got some scratches here and there. I'm not expecting miracles with this, but it definitely does need a good sponge down. And all I'm using is a little bit of water and some detergent to hopefully just take any grease off of this thing and just give it a quick spruce up. One thing I will say as well, you don't want to be using like the scouring side of this because you don't want to add any scratches, and you certainly don't want to remove any of the text off of this. I'm only using the soft sponge side and just giving it a good wipe down. Now, because we went to the trouble of cleaning the entire machine inside and out, all the circuit boards, it makes no sense not to wipe down the inside, so we're just going to run around the inside too. Now, as predicted, no great miracles here. Obviously, it's not going to take out any of the scratches, but it is a lot cleaner. It's got a slight sheen to it now that it's all had a good buff, and generally it smells a bit better. So we'll move on and clean up the side panels too. You can see here the plastic side panels are full of gunk as well, so we're just going to give these a good thorough clean inside and out. Again, no huge difference, but they do look better for having a good clean, and it's nice knowing there isn't a bunch of dirt and grime stuck behind the panels. Okay, so it's time for reassembly, my kind of favorite part really. We've done all of the hard work. It's time to put this thing back together so we can use it. One last thing to talk about is just the storage on this one. I showed you in part 1 there is a hard drive tray that you can pull out. I had a spare 40 gig hard drive that actually came out of my MPC 1000. I swapped that out for something else, so I've gone ahead and installed the 40 gig inside of this unit. The main reason for that being, of course, so that we can test that the hard drive slot is working, and it never hurts to have more storage built in. In terms of the main sample storage, I like to use the CF adapters that allow you to put an SD card into the CF slot. They look like this. I've had a couple of those from Amazon and they work just fine. I'm using one here that's already plugged in. This is a spare one for my MPC 1000. And I find the read speed to be adequate when you're loading samples up and stuff like that. Even with bigger folders, it seems okay to me. So let's dive in and start bolting this bad boy back together. Now we're going to start with the case, and it's really simple to put back on. There's no tricks to this, just lowering it carefully. I want to make sure I don't scratch the new paintwork on my little jog wheel. So we're just going to try and lower this thing down. Obviously, the main things to look out for, just your Tact switch buttons, just make sure that they're sitting and seated correctly. The same with your pads in the middle, make sure they're exactly where they should be. It's not stopping the case from dropping down. And then all we have to do is start buttoning it back up with the screws. I also mentioned when we were stripping it down in part 1, this was missing, I think, 3 screws. There was a couple missing from the underside of the top plate, and I believe there was one missing from the base plate on the bottom as well. That's where these little pots of screws come in handy. I'm going to start with the 3 that hold the top plate cover on the front. Next up, we'll replace the 3 screws that come across the back. And with those, you just want to be mindful that you're putting a little bit of pressure on the casing to make sure that it sits down where it needs to be. There are also 2 screws slightly lower down towards the bottom corners. We can now reattach this front panel, which has been cleaned. You need to remember to put the CD cover in as well. There are a couple of screws that come across the bottom, but also these countersunk screws that you've got to go into these little brass pins. Next up are the side panels. They sit in and then they have to slide back into position. And you've got 2 fairly decent sized screws that go in here and here. And finally, being mindful of your display again, I've just put a soft bag underneath and a little bit of tape over the display. We can put the final screws back into the base. I did take the base plate back off just one more time to make sure any dust had fallen through, give it one final sweep out. And you'll notice I've also found a rubber foot that fitted for the middle just to kind of complete things. And finally, to finish off, don't forget to refit your fader caps. And there we go, our MPC 2500 lives again. What I'll do to finish off is just take a couple of shots around the device for you guys to take a look at. It's far from perfect. It was a little bit beat up when we bought it. I'm going to call this phase 1 of the restoration. I think for phase 2, if I'm going to place an order maybe for some new pads from MPC stuff, then what I would do is I would replace all of these Tact switches that I 3D printed, probably for the originals again. I may even spend a little bit more time cleaning up the case and things like that. But for now, it is a fully functioning device. And if we take the cost of the JJOSXL out of the equation for a second, it's cost me around £265 in total because I had the screws, I had the rubber foot. The MPC itself cost me 250 quid, and I spent an extra 15 on the clear PLA to 3D print the buttons. The black spray paint I also had in the garage. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. It is for the nerds. It's for the people like me that want to geek out and watch these things being brought back to life. It is something that I truly enjoy doing. There is nothing like owning a piece of gear that you've put your heart and soul into it. That's why this one will be joining my permanent collection. It's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And as I say, stay tuned. Maybe we'll see phase 2 where we upgrade this thing a little bit further in the future. But for now, I'm going to enjoy using this and cooking up some beats. Catch you guys in the next episode. Take care.